Hi, we're in part 3 of Christianity and the Social Crisis by Walter Rauschenbusch. Chapter 1, he dives right into the deep end of the Old Testament, the prophets. His subhead is the historical roots of Christianity, the Hebrew prophets. Now this is of course counterintuitive for a lot of people today who want to position the Old Testament against the New, but not Rauschenbusch, despite the fact that he was sympathetic to the critical view of the Old Testament which had emerged in the generation that he was born. Rauschenbusch starts, it seems a long start to approach the most modern problems by talking of men who lived before Lycurgus and Solon gave laws to Sparta and Athens. What light can we get on the troubles of the great capitalistic republic of the West from men who tended sheep in Judea or meddled in the petty politics of the Semitic tribes? History is never antiquated because humanity is always fundamentally the same. It is always hungry for bread, sweaty with labor, struggling to wrest from nature and hostile men enough to feed its children. The welfare of the mass is always at odds with the selfish force of the strong. The exodus of the Roman plebeians and the Pennsylvania coal strike, the agrarian agitation of the Gracchi, and the rising of the Russian peasants, it is all the same tragic human life. And in all history, it would be hard to find any chapter so profoundly instructive and dignified by such sublime passion and ability as that in which the prophets took the leading part. Moreover, the life and thought of the Old Testament prophets are more to us than classical illustrations and sidelights. They are an integral part of the thought life of Christianity. From the beginning, the Christian Church appropriated the Bible of Israel as its own book, and thereby made the history of Israel part of the history of Christendom. That history lives in the heart of the Christian nations with a very real spiritual force. The average American knows more about David than about King Arthur, and more about the Exodus from Egypt than about the emigration of the Puritans. Throughout the Christian centuries, the historical material embodied in the Old Testament has been regarded as not merely instructive, but as authoritative. The social ideas drawn from it have been powerful factors in all attempts of Christianity to influence social and political life. Insofar as men have attempted to use the Old Testament as a code of model laws and institutions, and have applied these to modern conditions, regardless of the historical connections, these attempts have left a trail of blunder and disaster. Insofar as they have caught the spirit that burned in the hearts of the prophets and breathed in gentle humanity through the Mosaic law, the influence of the Old Testament has been one of the great permanent forces making for democracy and social justice. However, our views of the Bible may change. Every religious man will continue to recognize that to the elect minds of the Jewish people, God gave so vivid a consciousness of the divine will that in its main tendencies at least, their life and thought carries a permanent authority for all who wish to know the higher right of God. Their writings are like channel buoys anchored by God, and we shall do well to heed them now that the roar of an angry surf is in our ears. We shall confine this brief study of the Old Testament to the prophets, because they are the beating heart of the Old Testament. Modern study has shown that they were the real makers of the unique religious life of Israel. If all that proceeded from them, directly or indirectly, were eliminated from the Old Testament, there would be little left to appeal to the moral and religious judgment of the modern world. Moreover, a comprehension of the essential purpose and spirit of the prophets is necessary for a comprehension of the purpose and spirit of Jesus and of genuine Christianity. In Jesus and the primitive church, the prophetic spirit rose from the dead. To the ceremonial aspects of Jewish religion, Jesus was either indifferent or hostile. The thought of the prophets was the spiritual food that he assimilated in his own process of growth. With them he linked his points of view, the convictions which he regarded as axiomatic. Their spirit was to him what the soil and climate of a country are to its flora. The real meaning of his life and the real direction of his purposes can be understood only in that historical connection. Thus, a study of the prophets is not only of interest That is an interesting part in the history of social movements, but it is indispensable for any full comprehension of the social influence exerted by historical Christianity and for any true comprehension of the mind of Jesus Christ. A link to one of the surprises of my life, how we learned, my wife and I, Vivian, grace from the Old Testament. We see from Rauschenbusch's summary here the moral genius of the Old Testament, which was the inspiration of Jesus and the apostles, of course. But we learn, to our surprise and astonishment, that grace is embedded in narratives of the Old Testament, and primarily in the book of Genesis itself. So I'll put that link on your screen, how 2 Jehovah's Witnesses learned grace from the Old Testament book of Genesis.